Welcome to this session. In this session, we'll be talking about entrepreneurship. There are different aspects of entrepreneurship, and we will be touching upon one of the prime areas, which is technology management. Within technology management, one has to understand that there are plenty of complex activities which have to be looked into by an entrepreneur. For example, if you want to set up a factory that will manufacture certain kinds of goods, certain kind of products that will be marketed, it's not an easy task. He has to go through a series of complex activities, and there are so many in number that one has to have some kind of a planning mechanism, some kind of a controlling tool in order to be sure that the activities are proceeding in the right manner, they have the right interrelationships, and that he has a target to complete each activity within a certain amount of time, because after all, you have to complete activities within certain specific frames of time. Otherwise, activities will drag on and the completion of the project is going to be delayed. So in this session, we'll be primarily discussing about the project orientation to setting up, let's say, a factory or a service outlet from the point of view of an entrepreneur. Now, when we talk about a project, we talk about a project network. What is a project network? A project network is very simply a series of activities which are interrelated and interconnected with one another, and each of these activities are going to consume certain amount of time and certain amount of resources. Okay, every activity consumes time and consumes resources, and there are many such activities which have got certain interrelationships among them. How do you really plan out those activities so that all activities are done in the proper sequence, so that all the activities are actually completed, activities start at the right time, and activities are finished at the right time, so that the next and the subsequent activities can begin from that time onward? This is a complex task. You cannot handle such a task without a proper framework for planning out the activities, trying to coordinate them, and trying to control those activities in order to have your control over the final completion of the project. This is what we are going to discuss today. So network planning or network scheduling deals with such a set of activities which have to be planned, coordinated, and controlled with the objective of completing the task within a given time frame. Okay, is this clear? Yeah. Fine. Now let's start and understand why do we need to do this. Some of the issues are quite obvious. As we said that when you have got a project to be set up that involves a large number of activities, without such a framework, how can you control them? Okay, activities will go out of hand and they'll consume time and resources beyond what they should, and which will lead to suboptimal utilization of time and resources, which is not desirable. So you should be able to monitor the activities in a manner that they consume the optimal amount of time and the optimal amount of resources. Resources are expensive, so you have to always keep a tab on what you are spending, what is the quantum of resources you are consuming, so that there is no wasteful activity.
Otherwise, it may happen that what we have budgeted, it may go well past beyond that.
That's right. One of the common problems with most projects that are seen around the world, especially in this country, that projects run beyond times which they are targeted for, and they have cost overruns also. Okay, most projects, most big projects, most mega projects in the country, if you look around, you'll find that they last longer than they were scheduled, and they consume a lot bigger amount of money and resources than were planned. Okay, so if this is the situation, then I think it's very important for every entrepreneur to realize that they have to have a planning in order to get a proper grip over the project that they're executing.
So does this help in budgeting?
Of course it does, in the sense that when you're planning out, a budget is also a plan. Okay, when you're planning out, let's say, a series of activities that will lead to some completion of a project, you're budgeting out the different activities. You're planning out what are the activities to be accomplished, what are the costs to be incurred for those activities, what are the resources to be mobilized for those activities. That is nothing but a budget. So it is really a budget also reflected in the form of some network. And we are going to talk about that project network, which is what we discuss in a lot of detail after this. So network scheduling or network planning has got its obvious importance whenever you are trying to set up a project, a one-of-a-kind project, which is not a recurring kind of an activity. Let's say you set up a factory. That's not a recurring kind of an activity. You won't set up a factory every day. So when you are taking up an activity which is a non-recurring type, and a critical activity like setting up a plant, or even launching a new product, okay, then you would do well if you take the help of network planning and scheduling. Fine, let's now try and get into the basic building blocks of network scheduling. As we said, it is a series of activities. So the most important thing in any network scheduling is an activity. What is an activity? An activity is some task which has got to be accomplished in order to accomplish an overall objective. Okay, like for example, if you want to set up a factory, you have to first of all set up a building. Okay, now that's an activity. Now setting up a building in itself is a huge activity. You can break that down into smaller and smaller components. Okay, maybe you do the foundations, then you set up the columns, then you cast the slabs and the roofs. Okay, then you install machineries, and then you commission the machineries. Okay, you give trial run. So these can be looked upon as activities. However, it's important to understand that an activity should be described in a very unambiguous manner. It should be very clearly defined as to what this activity is, when does it start, when does it get over, how long does it last, and what are the resources that this activity will consume. There can be no ambiguity about this. So the most important, the first task for an entrepreneur in that case would be to list down the activities that are going to make up the overall project. Break down the different activities into minor and small components beyond which subdivision is not going to make any further meaning. Okay. But then once you have done that, then you have got a list of activities. A large number of activities are there on your list, and you know what each of these activities is all about and what are the resources and time that each activity would consume. Now that is a preliminary task.
So how activity is different from an event in that case?
Fine, that's an important question, a good question I would say. An activity is a task, as we say, but an event is a milestone. Do you see the difference? An event means either the beginning of an activity or the ending of an activity, or the beginning of a number of activities or the culmination of a number of activities. So an event is a point in time, okay, and it's not an activity in the sense that it does not consume time or resources. It defines a point in time from which an activity can begin or at which an activity will end. So normally activities and events are talked about in the same breath because the beginning of an activity is an event, the completion of an activity is also an event. As a matter of fact, they are denoted on the network with the help of arrows and nodes. Okay, like for example, an event is a node and an arrow denotes an activity. A pointed arrow shows that an activity begins with the tail node and ends in the head node. Do you understand what I mean? We are looking at a situation where we have got a tail node. Here is an activity that begins. This is the arrow that denotes the activity, and it ends in another event, which is the completion. Okay, so it is really a network of nodes and arrows. That's clear? Now, there will be several such arrows and several such nodes in a complex network. So it's important that you define each activity by a unique pair of node numbers. Suppose the tail node is node number 1 and the ending node of the activity is node number 2. That means you are talking about an activity 1, 2. You can of course name that activity as A, okay, and that activity A might consume a certain amount of time. Let's say it consumes 6 weeks of time. So basically the building block for any network plan is an activity that has got a particular name or a nomenclature like A. This A could be, let's say, setting up the foundation. Okay, and you have to spell out very clearly what is the amount of time this activity is going to take. So we are saying, let's say it will take 6 weeks. Okay, that's the amount of time this activity A will consume. You have to additionally spell out what are the different resources other than time that will be consumed by this activity A. Okay, now you have to repeat this for all the activities that are there on your list. Okay, so you have got a list of activities, their durations and their resources which have to be committed. Now the question is, they are all interrelated. So the next step would be trying to find out what is the precedence relationships between the activities. How are the different activities in the network interrelated with each other? Okay, in trying to do this, you have to very carefully examine the interrelationships. Which are the activities that can start without any other activities requiring to be completed? So, in other words, which are the beginning activities of the project? Let's say acquisition of land can be looked upon as a beginning activity for setting up a greenfield project. So there is no other activity that precedes the acquisition of land. Suppose there might be activities preceding that activity, but then let's assume that land is available easily and acquisition of land is the first activity that the entrepreneur will have to handle. And suppose he decides that it will take him, let's say, 6 months of time. So he commits a duration of time for which this activity will go on. And at the end of 6 months, he should be able to say that land has been acquired. So that's the physical interpretation of an arrow on a network. Okay. Now the point is, there can be other activities which can begin concurrently. They need not wait for land acquisition to be complete. Okay. For example, he wants to, let's say, purchase technology. Okay. He wants to tie up with someone, go into a collaboration with some partner. Now, such activities are not strictly dependent on his acquisition of land. So we can say that these can be called concurrent activities that can be undertaken along with certain other activities parallelly. There is no direct interference of one activity with the other. So there is a question of concurrent activities. Which are those activities that can run concurrently? Okay. So he can list down which are the activities that can run concurrently. However, all activities cannot run concurrently. There will be certain activities which will require certain other activities to be completed. Okay. For example, you cannot start setting up the machinery before the building has been set up. Okay. So even if the first machinery has to be set up, the requisite foundation for that machinery has to be completed. So it is dependent on the completion of certain other activities, certain other preceding activities. So this is a relationship between these two activities. Installation of a machine will depend on completion of the foundation for that machine. So he'll have to make sure that the foundation is ready when the machine is actually arrived and is ready for installation. So he need not order for the machine maybe until a certain amount of progress has been made on the building of the foundations.
So can we say that the acquisition of land, the land required, can be determined with the help of the project report?
Yes, of course. There can be, in fact, submission of a project report itself is an activity which has to be done prior to even acquisition of land. So we just took an example out of context, and because it's a physical example, easy for everyone to understand. That's why we say that acquisition of land, setting up a building, installation of machinery are very easy and physical to understand. That's why we say that. But even submission of a project report, getting the feasibility of the report to be worked out, and some approval given by the authorities are required, which have to precede the land acquisition as well.
Getting the financial loans and everything.
But the point is absolutely well taken in the sense that you have to therefore plan out everything right from the fact that you have decided to be an entrepreneur. The moment you decide that I will do something all by myself, that in itself is a decision. That's an event. And from that event will start all other activities. Like, for example, you set up a project report, and maybe you decide that how long the project report will take, what is going to be the project outlay, and who are the authorities who are going to sanction that project, give approval to that project. All these can run ahead of the acquisition of land. Absolutely so. So it's a good beginning that we have made. We are talking about even the idea of setting up a plant which is in the nascent stage, and we are talking about how to generate a project report, get permission, get approval, etc., and then actually get into the physical setting up of the plant. Fine. Coming back to what we were saying that there are precedence relationships. Certain activities need to be completed before certain activities can begin. And again, there are subsequent or following activities. Just as there are preceding activities, there are activities following certain activities. Like, for example, setting up a machinery is in fact an activity that would follow setting up of the foundation or the building. Okay. So what are the preceding activities for any activity? What are the activities following an activity? We have to generate that relationship in the form of some kind of a table. Sorry?
And what are the concurrent activities?
Absolutely right. So we have talked about 3 kinds of situations. We have talked about activities that can run concurrently, which have no preceding activities, absolute beginning activities. We have talked about activities that depend on other preceding activities, and we have talked about activities which have to be followed by certain other activities. Okay. Now, this is the interrelationship that we are trying to understand.
So there can be one path among the activity which measures the maximum time which can allotted, which is allotted
Absolutely
for
so.
a project time.
In fact, what you're referring to is called the critical path. And one of the most famous methods of network scheduling is the critical path method. Okay, let's take a break at this point of time. After we come back from the break, we will be talking about the critical path method in a lot of detail. Critical path method, or CPM. We'll discuss a lot about that issue after the break. Welcome back. We have been talking about network scheduling, and prior to the break we had introduced the subject of the critical path method, which is one of the most well-known techniques of network scheduling. CPM, or the critical path method, depends on activities and their events, like the starting of an activity or the completion of an activity, and each activity consumes time and resources. This we have explained prior to this break. Now let's move ahead from here. A CPM network looks like any complicated network. It is possible to draw a CPM network if there are a manageable number of activities, like maybe 10 activities or 12 activities, which can be physically depicted on a piece of paper. But as I said, the concepts that are introduced in this discussion are relevant even to huge projects running into hundreds of activities. Okay. Before we really go deep into the concept, there's one more thing I would like to talk about, which is called a dummy activity. Now, a dummy activity is a very important notion in the sense that it is an activity that does not consume time or resources. Now, you might find this quite amazing. What is an activity that does not consume any time or any resources? Then that is no activity. That's the reason it's called a dummy activity. It's a fictitious activity, but it has got a very important function in a network. Like this, I can explain to you with the help of a small network here. Suppose I tell you that there are 4 activities in a network, okay, A, B, C and D. Let me tell you that activity A has got no preceding activity. Similarly, activity B has got no preceding activity. Both of them, A and B, are starting activities for a small project. Okay. However, there are 2 other activities, C and D. Activity C is preceded by activities A and B. That means activity C cannot start before both A and B have been completed. Okay. Similarly, activity D is preceded immediately by activity B. That means activity D cannot start unless activity B is over. Okay. Now, if this is the interrelationship among these 4 activities, A, B, C and D, then can you try and draw a small network? Let us say we look at the first instance. This is node 1. Activity A goes from node 1 to node 2. Activity B starts from node 3, ends in node 4. Okay, they are parallel because both of them are beginning activities. There are no preceding activities. So we can depict them in a manner like this. And suppose we denote activity C as the arrow running between nodes 2 and 5, and activity D as running between node 4 and 6. Now, will I be right in depicting this network in this fashion?
No, sir.
No. It is quite obvious that is not a correct depiction because it does not fulfill the interrelationship requirement. Why? Because although activities A and B are starting activities, they are not dependent on any activities being finished before them. However, activity C requires that A and B have to be completed before it can start. But this diagram does not give you that relationship. It shows that activity starts only after A is over. What about B? B is still may not be over, and there is no connection between C and B. That is not right. So this is a wrong depiction of the network. Sample this. Suppose I designate this network in this fashion. Activity A runs from 1 to 3 and activity B runs from 2 to 3. They converge in node 3. They can, because after all both A and B are beginning activities. They are not dependent on one another. They begin at the same point of time, even at different times, but then they culminate in node 3. Okay, and from there node activity C takes off. That means activity C runs between node 3 and node 4, and activity D runs from node 3 to node 5. So this is a depiction, a possible depiction. Is this a right depiction of the network?
No.
It is not.
No,
Why is it so?
because D should precede
Only B.
Only B.
That's
Not
right.
A.
D is preceded by B only and not by A. But this network shows that D is preceded by both A and B, like C.
Hmm.
It is correct in depicting A and B and C, but it makes a mistake in depicting the activity D because it shows that D is dependent both on A and B being completed. But that is not the reality. So how do we denote an activity of this nature without mixing up the interrelationship or without making a compromise on the interrelationship? We cannot do that. Look at this network. Here, let's denote this activity A as 1, 3, and then B runs from 2 to 4, okay, parallelly. And activity C starts from node 3, ends in node 5. Activity D starts in node 4, ends in node 6. And we connect 3 and 4, rather 4 to 3, with the help of what is called a dummy activity. You can see this is denoted by a dotted line going from 4 to 3. What is the meaning of this? This is a dummy activity that does not consume any time. You can see I have not given any time commitment for this dummy activity. Okay, it is denoted as a dotted line. That means it is not a real activity, it's a virtual activity. So, but then the introduction of this dummy activity clearly tells you that the activity C is dependent on the completion of both A and B. It is dependent on the completion of A directly. It is also dependent on the completion of the activity B, and then subsequently a dummy activity connects it to the node 3, showing that C cannot start until both A and B are over. Okay, but look at D. D depends only on the completion of B as it should be. It does not depend on the completion of A. So this is the implication of a dummy activity which does not consume any time or resources, but then helps to clarify the interrelationship between a set of activities.
So in a complex network diagram, there can be more than one dummy activity.
There can be
also.
more than one dummy. There can be a number of dummy activities trying to clarify the interrelationship. When you have got such a situation, then it's a dummy activity that can really help clarify the interrelationship between those activities. And you'll find the use of dummy activities in networks quite a number of times. Okay.
So it can be also be simultaneous activities which can be performed side by side.
Of course, like A and B in this case are activities which do not depend on one another.
Right.
And they are being performed concurrently or simultaneously, as you're saying.
Right.
Okay, that's there. But then here you find that C is an activity that depends on completion of A and B.
Yes.
So these are the immediately preceding activities of C.
That means we can say that D can be completed before C.
D can be completed before C, fine. No problem, because D does not depend on C
Yes,
at all.
C.
See, D does not depend on C.
Right.
Okay, in fact, this diagram does not tell you that D has to be completed before C.
Okay.
I mean, we have not put the timings here. We have only tried to show the relationship, what depends on what activity.
So this also
Okay.
indicates a workflow. diagram.
Definitely, all these activities indicate the flow of work from one end to the other. That brings us to a very important point. What you say is very important in the sense that there is a unidirectional flow through the network. Okay, there is in fact no backtracking ever. You will never find a network where activities are going back in a direction opposite to all other activities, because that can create a loop.
Yes.
And you have never got a loop in a network. A network proceeds in a unidirectional manner. If you have to repeat an activity within the network, then you have to show that activity again as a separate activity at a subsequent point of time. But then you cannot go back to an activity in a network. That's not permitted.
So in case of a line process,
Yeah.
then if there is a problem
Right.
with manufacturing
Yeah.
and we have to go back to the previous activity, what do we do then?
No, fine. What you're referring to is a line assembly, okay? Assembly line operation, like automobiles are used in an assembly line operation. There, if you would remember, they always are assembled in a manner where if you have to repeat an activity, that equipment and that operation has to be repeated downstream. You cannot go back along the assembly line. The assembly line moves from one end, the raw materials end, to the finished product end, all along in the same direction. There is no backtracking. That's very similar to what we are discussing here. If you have to repeat an activity, at a subsequent point of time, then you have to repeat that activity as simple as that downstream. You cannot go back to that activity by backtracking through the network. You cannot do that. Similar is the case here.
So also to have a good streamlined flow of
Yeah.
work, we also need to prevent zigzag motion as far as possible.
That is right. However, in a network, you'll find zigzag motion, but then they are in the same direction.
Same direction.
You're not going back
Any
in the reverse direction. That is never done. Okay, fine. So if the basic concepts are now in place, therefore we are now in a position maybe to discuss how we work through this network and find out what is the time to be consumed by each of these activities, and therefore what is the overall time for completion of the complete project. Okay, fine. So we will have to come back and discuss a lot more on this issue, because there are very important concepts that are yet to be discussed, and we take up this in some other subsequent session. Thank you very much.